I'm Ruveyda Gozen, a research economist at the Program on Innovation and Diffusion and the London School of Economics.
And I'm John van Reenen. I'm the co-host here. We're very excited to have our special guest here, Stefanie Stantcheva. I hope I pronounced that right, Stefanie. I always used to call you Stefanie without the surname. And we're going to be talking about some of Stefanie's work and her background. And I'm particularly excited by this episode. I first met Stefanie, she probably doesn't remember this, when she was giving her job market talk at Harvard. I was totally blown away by how amazing her job market paper was and how her research was. So, and since then, over the last 10 years or so, she's had this kind of meteoric rise, producing more and more interesting work, including on innovation. So very much thank you for coming, Stefanie, and looking forward to talking.
Well, thank you for having me, and you've contributed a lot to all that agenda on innovation. So we have to thank you for a lot of input and feedback over the years.
I mean, I generally introduce people, like I say, for instance, I would introduce you as Nathaniel Rose, professor of political economy at Harvard. But I think I want to change it today and say, we're with one of the Taylor Swifts of economics today.
Oh, no, my God.
You're very productive, and if you look at the CVs, the number of awards and everything, I think it would. But yeah, I mean, I'm so happy to have you here. We're so excited to have you here. And I mean, for those who don't know, Stefanie works on taxation and its effect on wealth distribution, inequality, and innovations a lot. And I also, so far we have, recorded these episodes in the summer, and we were publishing those episodes so far. And this is the one that we're doing now in the winter. And then, and we're going to publish this probably after Darno Samoglu's episode. So, I mean, I wrote one of the questions, I write some of the questions and prepare some of the questions beforehand. And one of the questions that I wrote for you was, who is Stefanie and what is her production function? Do you have any specific habits? Maybe we can start with yourself first, and then we will talk a little bit more about, the research stuff.
Well, that's a very deep philosophical question. I like to think of myself as both a public economist and also a political economy person who's trying to mix a little bit all these fields together, adding in a bit of macro, a bit of labor where relevant, and so I'm trying to always focus on the topics that are of interest to me in a given moment, and to really dive deep into them for as long as I feel like I can make progress. And the production function is a really interesting question because it varies so much over time, and it varies a lot project by project. I think one of the great things for us as researchers is that we get to work with so many different people, and different teams will have very different dynamics. So often we completely adapt the process to whoever's on the project. I work with co-authors who have a super defined and really well working system, so I'm adapting to their system when I work with them. Other times it's more my system that might take over, and so it really varies a lot. But I think one common thing of the production function is that there's always really, really great co-authors, whether it's peers, whether it's students. I'm super lucky to have really, really amazing students, and I'm always very eager to work with them. It's always been really great people, so that would be probably the major perk in my production function.
That's really nice to hear. And do you have any specific habits? Are you, I mean, these are very light questions, right? Are you a morning person, or, are you a night owl? Do you have such kind of, or maybe if I don't drink 5 cups of coffee, I can't come to myself and, work well. Do you have such kind of small habits?
I'm definitely a morning person. The earlier in the day is way better for me, and I like to wake up when it's early and have the day, ahead of me. So that's for sure. But in terms of other habits, no, I think I'm quite flexible, and I think it comes from this feeling that I'm already super lucky to do the job that I do, and to have the just, amazing opportunities that I have, that I really should be taking advantage of them, whatever the other circumstances. And I don't wait for everything to be perfect to get started, but I just try to get started.
So one of the things, that I also, ask other guests was, for instance, was there someone, I mean, you did your PhD, and then now you're a professor, and did someone from your childhood or your family like have an impact on you, to choose this path? Or was there, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be, someone from your family, but like, is there an economist or a philosopher that had a large impact on your thinking?
So actually, it's definitely part of like the family history in a sense, but I think it's the whole way that my childhood and early years went. For a tiny bit of background, I'm born in Bulgaria. Both my parents are Bulgarian, and for a while before the Berlin Wall came down, we lived in Eastern Germany, and then moved to France. And so I witnessed a lot of very different economic and social situations growing up, and very stark inequalities, whether it was between Bulgaria and France, between Eastern Germany and Western Germany. So I was always very shocked by the sort of by the inequalities that you can see and that you can't really explain as a child. I'm not sure I can explain them now either entirely. And there were a lot of economic things happening, which were sort of daily discussions, which at that time I did not know were economic topics, or, I didn't understand them at all. For instance, there was a constant discussion of the inflation rate in Bulgaria. It was like a daily topic, of the exchange rate, of, pegging the Bulgarian money to the Deutsche Mark. So all these things that were constant daily conversations, which I did not understand, but over time, I got really interested in them. And when I discovered that there's a field called economics that's actually thinking about these issues, I was pretty convinced that that's what I wanted to do.
I mean, I grew up in Turkey, and I think one of the things, if you talk to economists, when you said it's a daily thing, I think that defines also a lot about what Turkish people, for instance, experience even right now. So I can relate to that. John, I also want to ask you the same question. Like, was there someone in your family or like an economist or a philosopher that you were influenced by, to choose economics, or was it just you who discovered your inner kind of spark, and then you decided to do economics?
Well, my father was a sociologist, so all my parents, and both my parents and my sister, they all left school at 16, at the minimum school leaving age. But my father went back and studied, finished his high school at night school, and then went to university when he was much older, like in his late 20s, and became a sociologist. So I was always growing up having lots of discussions with him. He was an immigrant from South Africa who's a political refugee along with my grandfather. So we were always discussing politics and economics. And that's what got me interested in it, really. I was interested just in how human society works. And, in some sense, coming through it through lots of different prisms. I mean, I think the clash, the two, obviously Marx was an influence, but also Weber, Schumpeter, the kind of battle between the creation of rents through innovation and then the capture of rents through the class struggle, if you like, was one of the things which motivated my thinking and my PhD.
And I mean, I agree. Like Karl Marx and all these great thinkers also shape our lives probably when we were even younger. So one of the tools that a government uses, I mean, not even like we're not even talking about nation states that we have right now, but also empires. They use taxation, and right now we think that we can use taxation to foster growth or improve economic welfare, and we know that economic incentives are crucial for inventors or entrepreneurs. So maybe we can start with a general question, like what is the relationship between taxation and innovation throughout history? And are there any systematic patterns that you observe?
Yes, it's a really great and important question because I think we have this slight misperception in our minds when we think of like superstar inventors, like the Polaroid inventor, the Bell Labs, all these amazing big inventors and teams. We tend to think of them as driven scientists, and it's hard to think that they would necessarily respond to financial incentives beyond intellectual achievement. um, but actually innovation is an economic activity like many others, even though it might differ in some dimensions. It's more a matter of a degree, a quantitative issue, rather than a totally different activity. And so it's a very valid question. To what extent do taxes on corporations or on people affect the amount of innovation, where it happens, the quality of it, which taxes play a bigger role, etc. And there's a lot to talk about here, but I think the history of the United States is perhaps a really interesting one, and the one I've in this case worked most on. it's very hard to answer this question because you would need really long run data, right, on both innovation and taxation. And then you would need a way to really say, oh, this is the causal effect of taxes. It's not related to other things going on at the same time. So it's a really tricky question. But in a project called very originally Innovation and Taxation over the 20th century, we tried to like bridge this data gap and construct a panel of all the inventors in the United States, basically over the whole 20th century, with their associated patents, where they lived, which companies they worked for, how many innovations they produced, of what quality, and then combine this with data sets on corporate taxes and personal taxes. And the US is really interesting because states have different personal and corporate taxes. And so you can really study within the same country, but still very many different jurisdictions, these tax effects that happen over time. And the findings are quite interesting. I mean, innovation, yes, does respond to taxation, both personal and corporate taxes, in terms of the number of inventions, where they happen, in which state they happen, and less so to how good they are. So what we see is there's much less of an effect of these taxes on sort of the average quality of innovation. But the quantity and the location are really affected. And it's useful to think about sort of corporate inventors who work really mainly for companies, versus individual inventors, because they operate outside of firms, and so they have different motivations or incentives. And what we can see is that at the macro state level, strong effects of both the personal and the corporate tax on like total innovation that happens and total number of inventors who live in that state. And at the micro level, if you look at the individual inventors, whether corporate or personal, they really respond to taxes as well, and they mostly respond to the more direct tax. So, for instance, corporate inventors will mainly respond to the corporate tax. Personal inventors will mainly be driven by the personal income tax. And it affects their probability of producing patents. It affects where they live. And again, does not really affect the quality, the average quality of the patents that they produce. And the last, perhaps really interesting finding is the difference between the personal and the corporate tax that we see. So if you think about this cross-state, effect, part of it is a true, if you want, value-added effect. So lower taxes, you produce more innovations. But part of it is simply a reshuffling across states, sort of a zero-sum effect from the federal perspective, where resources just get shuffled across states in terms of, for instance, inventors moving. And what we see is that actually a big share of the corporate tax seems to come from these mobility responses, which to a large extent are simply moving people across states, are a bit of a sort of tax competition that's sort of zero sum from the federal level. While the personal income tax, there's definitely mobility effects, but there's also some true, really innovation output responses, if you want. So there's a bit of a difference here, where the corporate tax is very sort of prone to tax competition effects.
The paper that Stefanie is describing is, a very influential paper, and I have to say that it's one of the papers which have really changed my mind about this. I mean, I was always a bit of a skeptic about, the magnitude of the impact that personal taxes could have on innovation. Some of the work that I've done, like the Los Einstein's work, focuses much more on other things which drive whether people innovate or not, their exposure to the possibility of becoming an inventor when they're young, and the impact of personal taxes. One could say, well, does that really have a big effect on whether someone becomes an inventor? And even when they become an inventor, does it have an effect on how much they do? And I think Stefanie's work does suggest, there really is an effect of personal taxation on innovation. I want to ask you, though, what you think about the magnitudes, the size of those effects, and what the policy implications would be. Many people would say, well, okay, this is an argument, in favor of things like reducing radically taxes at the top of the distribution to incentivize people to innovate more. How could you draw out a bit more about what this would mean for what government should be doing?
Absolutely. So does that mean the only way is to decrease taxes? No, there's quite a few qualifying things here. The first is that, as I mentioned, well, from the federal perspective, a lot of this effect, especially for the corporate tax, is a zero-sum effect. So there's this tax competition that can happen, but it's not like producing any value for the US as a whole. It's simply reshuffling where innovation happens. And we see that in many other settings too. In European countries, there's a competition for high skilled immigrants with all these differential, preferential tax regimes implemented for high skilled foreigners, which are really beggar thy neighbor policies. They're not good from the point of view of a coordinated, equilibrium. And so that's a major qualifying thing here. The other thing we see is that you can look at the effects of taxes sort of partially, right? Sort of all else equal, increased taxes, what happens? But you can also take into account what taxes actually finance, right? We tax for certain reasons, and one of them is to finance infrastructure, amenities, public goods. And what we can see is that inventors are quite sensitive to those public goods. So when you include these amenities that will be financed by the taxes, innovation infrastructures that are made better, just general public goods, it really dampens the effect of taxes. So people like having those things, and taxes are, unavoidably a way to pay for it. So that is another trade-off here. And if you look at a place like California, California has really high taxes, but California by now also has a lot of what you could call amenities, not just in terms of the infrastructure, but also now in terms of other people who are there. And so this agglomeration effect is very much, dampening any response to taxes, and arguably it has been facilitated by having these taxes in place. And the third thing that's really important is that it's only one small part of the tax equation, what you might say the optimal tax equation, which is this is really just capturing the efficiency cost of taxes. But taxes have a benefit, raising revenues, redistributing income. And so depending on the weight you put on those things, you might still want to have, high or, whatever level of taxes given any efficiency cost. For instance, if you care a lot about inequality and still want to redistribute, or if you have lots of revenue needs. So it's only one part of this equation that balances the equity and revenue raising benefits of taxes against their efficiency costs.
I was also thinking whether, since we're talking about inventors, like, is there a homogenous kind of a reshuffling effect for everyone, for all the inventors, or do you observe any heterogeneous effects, like for immigrants, for instance, like where they choose to go based on taxation? I don't know if this is likely, but I mean, do you observe any heterogeneous effects, like among immigrant inventors or among minorities?
So what we do see in and that's really another project which is more looking at cross country mobility of inventors over time. What we see is that superstar inventors, the ones who are really productive, who are really producing a lot and a lot of high quality innovations, they're very sensitive to taxes. It's very similar in the end to other really high skilled groups. There was a paper that was looking at football players across European countries, highly mobile, really high earning, want to take advantage of the tax differential. It's hard to look at necessarily many other professions because we lack international panel data, but it's likely that many high skilled sort of low attachment individuals are actually willing to to move for better financial outcomes. But even there, what you see is that if you just want to predict where inventors will live, the biggest predictor is what's their home country. So most people stay, where they are from to a first order. So it's not that immigration is the major, the major factor in the data. A really small share of people ends up moving, and so the home country has a very, very big attachment. And then how sensitive you are also will depend on whether the countries share the same language, how far they are. So clearly, not everybody is having the same set to choose from and the same elasticities to every other country's taxation.
And also, I mean, we're talking about, for instance, inventors, or already made inventors, I mean, they have maybe patents, etc. But how about, young people, let's say, who haven't become an inventor yet, but they might be, and they have the talent? Do you observe like any kind of behavioral responses to kind of like taxation policies that affect redistribution effects? Like, let's say, with taxation, we can have, better economic welfare. Do you observe that, more and more people from, let's say, different socioeconomic backgrounds, if you have a better tax policy, do you observe those people coming out and becoming inventors as well?
I mean, I think it goes, I mean, it's related to my question in a sense, because I think that once you're an inventor, I can see a bigger role for taxes in terms of maybe deciding where I want to live, like Stefanie was describing, which country, which part of the US. Maybe I work a bit harder or a bit less hard on the margin. I think when you're thinking at the earlier stage that you're talking about Ruveyda, who gets the chance to become an inventor, my sense at least is that we think the extensive margin is less sensitive to tax. So going back to what Stefanie said, you might want to say, I might want to have some high taxes, even that might discourage some inventors inventing a bit, and use that to invest in the kind of human capital of many people who could become inventors but don't become inventors because they don't get the opportunity, so they go to a bad school or live in a poor area. So I don't think we have good empirical evidence on this. It's hard because having the time horizons to see this is difficult. But my sense, at least, I think that that's probably a kind of reconciliation between some of my work and some of the work that Stefanie has done, in the sense of there's a long run effect about who becomes an inventor, and then there's another effect about what you do maybe when you've actually started to become an inventor afterwards. But it's certainly I think there could be a lot more interesting work to be done here. If any students listening to this, then I think this is a really interesting area for research.
That's right.
One thing I want to just add to John's point, which I completely agree with, is one way to think about this link is that equality of outcomes for one generation, like say the parents, if you redistribute in the parents' generation through taxes, is equality of opportunity for the next generation. Right? Those kids will start from much more of a level playing field, and I think John's work has shown, that opportunities are just vastly different for people from different backgrounds to become. And so if those initial conditions are more equalized by a more redistributive tax system, again, it hasn't really been, I don't know that this has been studied formally, but you could imagine that it can actually equalize chances for kids from these backgrounds.
That's right. And also that reminded me, since we were talking about this, inequality issues a bit, you have a very recent paper on wealth and property taxation that you provide in new novel data on wealth inequality in the United States in the 19th century. And you observe stark differences across regions. And over time, you observe that there's a huge wealth accumulation change in the US at that time. Can you also tell us a bit about, because it's related to inequality, and you observe, for instance, the South isn't doing that well. That would have implications even for today right now, because you also look at the long run effects. Can you tell us a bit about those, that study also?
Absolutely. So it's actually a fascinating fact about US history, which is not that well known, but the US used to essentially have something that was very much like a wealth tax in the whole 19th century until the 1930s, and it was called the general property tax. And so we tend to think of it as the property tax today, which is just on real estate, on housing, but actually the word general in there is very true. It was supposed to apply to all forms of assets. So your land, your livestock, your inventory as a merchant, your business, your bonds, your stocks. So it was supposed to be a comprehensive tax that would cover essentially all private wealth. And the great benefit for us from that tax is that because of its administration, there's a huge trail of data that was left. And that data is not in pretty shape. It was very painful to put it together, but it's essentially in tax assessors' records and state reports, where they have collected in this town, in this county, this is the amount of wealth that was assessed. This is what the market value should have been. So you can actually get the difference between the assessed values and the market value. And you can trace this over time, over a really, really long period. Nationally, you can really go back in time to the 1800s. At the state level, you can start pretty much when states join the union, or become states. And you can also dive into the county level and even the city level for a slightly more recent periods. So it's really fascinating data on basically the property, the wealth that was there locally. And there's a few really striking findings. One of them is before the Civil War, things did look quite different. Wealth was was differently distributed. But after the Civil War, when wealth was reshuffled, from then on, it's highly, highly persistent at the spatial level. So if you run this forward, 60 years to the 1930s, it's the same states and definitely the same counties even that were rich, right after the Civil War that remained the richest. And in fact, if you push it forward all the way to today, where we don't really have wealth at that subnational level, but for instance, income data from the Opportunity Atlas by my colleague Rash Chetty, you can see a very strong correlation between places which are income richest today and places that were wealth richest, 100, 120, 40 years ago. So very high persistence of wealth at the spatial level in the US.
How is slavery related to this? So before the Civil War, were slaves counted as part of people's capital? Were they treated as assets because of the fact they were enslaved and were not able to move?
Yes, so the history of slavery in the U.S. is really tightly linked to this property tax. Enslaved people were assessed as personal property of the enslavers before the Civil War, and in fact, if you look at the southern states, in many of these states, 50% of the total wealth of white enslavers was accounted for by the enslaved people.
Wow.
Florida, Texas, Georgia, you see these enormous amounts of enslaver wealth that's basically in the form of enslaved people. And so clearly it's something that played a huge role. And in fact, when you think about it, it really, obviously it is not wealth, right? This is like human labor. It's forced labor that is counted as someone's property. So if you took that out, given the numbers I just told you, the South was always very poor in terms of, physical property. It was basically sustained. The whole economy was simply built on the shoulders of enslaved people. And so after the Civil War, it looks like there's a gigantic dip in wealth in the South, but it's simply because you no longer wrongly count, forced labor as property of someone else. And so you can really see that persistence as well. Those states in the South, those counties in the South that had the highest shares of enslaved population or enslaved property also did much, much more poorly over the long run, like 60 years ahead. The growth is significantly lower in those places. And the South sort of always lags behind the other places.
People sometimes treat it as like, oh, slavery is over now, and then it was in the past. And it's when you look at all these findings, it's just like it wasn't something that happened like, let's say, 100 years ago. It didn't stay over there. I mean, it has long lasting effects on society, on economics, and as you say, I mean, it's very striking to find that those poor counties, they stayed poor for quite a long time. So I think it has really important implications on today and today's politics as well, I think.
I'd love it because I know there's we've got limited time. I'd love to talk a bit more about some of Stefanie's more recent work on the social economics lab, which is this new innovation, kind of research innovation. I think that she's been involved with, looking at the attitudes that people have towards taxation and policies. So I'd love to. I mean, there's lots of ways that we could go into. I don't know. I mean, one thing one recent paper I was looking at that you were doing, Stefanie, was on people's attitudes towards climate change, and how, I mean, you maybe talk a bit more about that, but both on the perception of climate change, but more importantly about what support they have for different policies to tackle climate change.
Great, thank you. I would love to talk about that. So first, about the social economics lab, it's really a project very, very dear to my heart, and that involves a lot of really great students and younger people and other researchers, where the goal is really to use this incredibly useful tool of surveys and experiments to really shed light on people's understanding of economic policies and what shapes their reasoning, what shapes their views, what concerns them, how do they think. And so it's really something that has, in my view, fostered my understanding of all these issues. And the paper you're mentioning on climate change, yes, it's a very recent one. And the question that we're asking there is, it's obvious that climate change is a big problem, but what are the obstacles to support? You can think about perhaps a lack of knowledge on climate change? Or is it information about the policies themselves and lack of awareness of that? Is it that people simply are not as worried as we think and not that concerned? So what is going on? So we have this large-scale project in 20 countries, trying to pick both high-income and middle-income countries, and basically including most of the emitting countries. So together, these countries emit more than 70% of global CO2 emissions. So it's the biggest polluters. And the first result is that people are very, very concerned about climate change. So it's expressed in different parts of the survey. They worry about the consequences of it. They're acutely aware of how it might impact them. So there's a lot of worry about it. So one hypothesis we can almost immediately, strike is that people are not concerned about climate change or don't anticipate disastrous consequences from it. Instead, what we see is that people have three other very important concerns that sort of foster or prevent their support for climate policy. So the first is, what will matter for them is a policy going to be effective in reducing emissions? And that's unfortunately quite hard to understand very often. When you think about, let's say, a carbon tax, a 10% carbon tax or something, what is it going to do to emissions? What is it then going to do to temperatures? What is it then going to do, to my specific area? These are a lot of complex chains of events, which even scientists, don't necessarily understand that well. And so it's very hard to trace that effectiveness. The second big concern is, will it hurt my household economically? So you can call that the self-interest. Not surprising that it's there. And that is reflected in, for instance, the fact that people who are lower income, people who are more reliant on polluting energies, who live in rural areas where they have very few means to substitute away, from polluting technologies, those people, the self-interest concern makes them automatically support less climate action. But the third concern is also very interesting, which is it goes way beyond self-interest. People are also really concerned about the equity of climate policies. So will climate policies disproportionately hurt poor or lower income households? And the perception for many policies is that they are quite regressive. So the burden will fall a lot on lower income people instead of higher income people. And so a lot of them are perceived to be quite regressive. So if we take these three concerns together, what's aligned with people's self-interest, more or less, what is perceived to be effective, what is perceived to be more progressive rather than regressive, you see that policies that end up being more supported are typically targeted investment programs that are financed either progressively by taxes or by public debt. So, for instance, green infrastructure programs, new low carbon technologies, or taxes like carbon taxes, but only if the revenues are used in a strongly progressive way. For instance, cash transfer to the poorest or the households who will be most impacted by the adjustment, or if the revenues are earmarked specifically for climate change, let's say green investments.
So, Stephanie, on that last point, I mean, economists, we've been banging on about having carbon taxes and the need to do these kind of compensation mechanisms for the groups who are losing out, a lot. But it doesn't seem. But why is that not working? I mean, is it because we haven't been saying that message loudly enough that you want to use the revenues in a way which compensates the losers, or is it partly because of a lack of trust that you don't actually trust the governments to use the revenue? And this is a more general point I feel about taxation, is that people say they're prepared to pay higher taxes, or especially higher taxes for other people, but they are reluctant to do that because they don't believe the revenues are going to be used wisely. I mean, so do you have a sense of which of those is the dominant force and what we could do about it?
I think you're exactly putting your fingers on the two relevant things, because both of them are really relevant. The first is that many of the existing schemes end up, for instance, suggesting to give equal cash transfers to everyone, or put the carbon taxes back into general revenues, which will then be quote unquote spent progressively, in many countries. But that is not perceived as progressive enough if we trust our survey findings. People don't think cash transfers equally back to everyone is good. They really want them very targeted, and towards the lowest income people, the most vulnerable people. At the same time, there's that issue of trust, and so people very much insist on having the taxes earmarked, either for that redistribution or for other, environmentally related expenses, like helping people change their infrastructure, like their heating or their car. And this is actually rare to have. In many countries, it's tough to earmark revenues from a specific tax. Sometimes it's even against the constitution, and so it ends up being, a matter of trust, whether you do trust the government to do that over many years ahead, or at some point start taking revenue back into other general public spending. So I think those are exactly two concerns that come out of this.
Has that changed your views? Because, I mean, economists, myself included, the jargon for this earmarking is called hypothecation. And we're always generally quite against that because it can be very cumbersome to tie all your taxes towards spending in a particular way. Are you moving towards seeing that as a necessary thing to do in order to get this political, economy aspect of our environmental policy working?
So what was interesting to me is really the way that this equity concern has in this whole concern about climate policies. I try to not go with too many priors into projects, but for instance, it's not surprising that there's a clear self-interest there, and that if you help people financially with some adaptation, they'll be much more supportive. So that part is not surprising. But this equity concern really is very, very strong. And one other way in which it reflects is, again, something puzzling to us economists. Why would people prefer outright regulation in some cases than corrective taxes? We would prefer in many, many cases corrective taxes. For instance, tax polluting vehicles or tax their emissions rather than ban polluting vehicles altogether. But no, in many people's minds, again, because of this equity concern, it seems to be fair that everybody is subject to the same regulation rather than some can pay to pollute. And so that was another very, very surprising finding. And I do think it's something to be taken seriously because in our models, of course, it doesn't make sense to have this. There's many more efficient ways to do it. But in the world, truly, there are political economy constraints, and people have often, rightly so, concerns that things can be trusted to be like that for many years ahead when governments change, or that something will not be subject to lobby groups or capture. And so that's the cost of having these frictions in the real world, is that there might be some less efficient policies in order to, compensate for these other frictions out there.
I totally agree. I mean, I think I'm very much coming around to the certainly in climate change that our standard things of just having carbon taxes by themselves is not going to work. I mean, you can see this in the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, which is an example of trying to have a policy which has a very visible effect in terms of the benefits that it accrues to people who might be losing out, and does something directly. Of course, it seems very inefficient industrial policy compared to taxes or even regulation, but it may, from a political point of view, be the most effective game in town.
I think you also work on in that lab related to income inequality, not maybe the environmental aspect of it. But do you remember any finding that's like that you said, okay, this is very striking, like, in terms of income inequality, whether the wealthier people should be taxed more or not? Like, do you observe such kind of an interesting finding that did you find such results?
Well, obviously, I'm very biased because I find all the results interesting. But one
Yeah.
super recent project, which I hope you will find interesting, is I didn't appreciate the extent to which certain mindsets play an important role for our general worldview and translate into our policy views too. And one of these mindsets is the idea of zero sum thinking. The idea that the world is, with a limited amount of resources, and if one group or one individual gains, this has to come at the expense of others. And this is a mindset we study with Nathan Nunn, Sandra Sequeira, and Sahil Chinoy at Harvard. Again, through this large-scale survey where we also dig into people's ancestry and their past to try to understand their family experiences and their own experiences. And we see that people who have this more zero-sum thinking across different domains, whether it is, do immigrants gain at the expense of non-immigrants? Do rich people gain at the expense of poor people, etc.? People support, much more redistribution when they have this mindset, because they feel like, the advantaged groups, whatever they might be, have become rich at the expense of disadvantaged groups. And so there's a role for the government to step in and correct this. It's a very, very like corrective argument for redistribution. And it's a very, very strong predictor of your policy view, and interestingly cuts completely across partisan lines. So sort of within party, the people who are more zero sum will be more, redistributive. They'll also be much more prone to support affirmative action and policies for gender or racial equality. They will also be much more anti-immigrants. Again, with this idea that this will hurt people in the country if there are more immigrants. So a really interesting mindset that shapes policy views, and that's very related to your family history and your own personal history. Since we were talking about enslavement earlier, again, it shows up here very strongly. People who have any enslaved history in their family, and that could be, the chattel slavery in the U.S. South, could also be the Holocaust or other, enslavement experiences, have a much more zero-sum mindset, even 3 generations down. And on the other hand, people who have been immigrants or have an immigrant experience are much less zero-sum. And similarly, people who have experienced upward mobility in their family at any generation are much more prone to viewing the world in positive sum terms. So there's really interesting things in the family history even that shape our views and ultimately our policy views.
One of the things in our politics in the last few years around the world has been this growth of zero-sum thinking. So more and more populist political movements seem to embrace the zero-sum attitude and become more anti-immigrant, for example. What does your research say anything about that? Why the global equilibrium has shifted towards more zero-sum thinking?
Yes, I'm glad you're asking that question, because one super striking pattern that we see is that young people are much more zero-sum than older people. And so that's very puzzling. And we try to understand, is this a cohort effect or an age effect? And it turns out it's very strongly a cohort effect. And it's linked to the economic environments in which these people grow up in. So in a place like the US, and that's also true for lots of, Western Europe and the UK, mobility and growth used to be higher. And so older cohorts have grown up in places that have higher growth, higher mobility, and they're less zero-sum. Younger generations are growing up in environments with lower growth, lower mobility, and accordingly, they're much more zero-sum. You see a very inverted pattern in places where, things used to be worse and today are better. Many developing countries or emerging markets, we have the opposite pattern. The younger generation is less zero-sum than the older generations. So there's this very strong cohort effect. And I think in Western countries, in the US, this rise in several policies and zero-sum thinking, it seems to very much be a cohort effect that's sort of diffusing. And it will be interesting to see where it goes.
That's very puzzling. I mean, when you talked about, young people, I would definitely say that they're probably open to immigrants more than the older, but that's very interesting. I mean,
there's a big difference between men and women. So if you look at young men actually are much more. I don't know if it would be zero sum. I suspect it is becoming much less liberal than young women are. So the difference between attitudes has really increased amongst younger cohorts in many countries, which makes dating a problem, I bet.
Might be. And also, I mean, since we talked about, politics a bit, I mean, did you have any you do a lot of work in, all these, experiments and online surveys, etc. So how do politicians perceive your studies? Like, how is their reaction in general, to your research?
So I see quite a bit of interest in general. So I do some policy work as well, mainly in France. I'm quite involved there. So I always build on the research findings for any recommendations or policy report that I have to write. And typically, I think there's a lot of interest because I think people understand the extent to which it's valuable to understand how citizens think and how they reason and what valid concerns they have. And I think this is helping us do that. So I hope this continues.
That's very nice. So I want to ask you a few more questions, and then I also prepared some cheesy questions for you that I want to also go over with you. So maybe the final question related to research could be: what are the other current projects that you're working on, and what are the areas that you would suggest young people, PhD students, postdocs, young researchers, to focus on in this area?
Well, in terms of the other projects, there's really too many to count. Let me mention the thing I'm working on literally this morning, which is on people's understanding of inflation. So there's some really interesting findings there. It's in progress, so hopefully I can share that soon. And I think it's also a policy and a just economic phenomenon that's really really complex and affects people's daily lives. So I think it will be very interesting. In terms of the topics for young researchers, I really genuinely think that there's so many interesting things that people should follow their interest. We have so many unanswered questions, and I think questions and problems are popping up much more rapidly than research can answer. There's amazing new data sets out there, and I think new technologies are offering such interesting possibilities. So I think pretty much any interest can be turned into very useful research. So would very much encourage people to follow what they want to think about.
I mean, when we look at your CV, I mean, we see the successes and all the awards and everything. But what was the biggest challenge that you remember, or maybe if even a failure, like in a project, in your role in the past, right now? How did you tackle, or how are you tackling it? If it's happening right now.
No, I mean this is really excellent because it's like on social media, it's just very easy to see the good sides, really, right, externally. But rejections are just constant. That is, it might not look that way from the outside, but it's a constant thing, and so it is something that is, you pick up and you keep going. I think one very big challenge is uh, to find the time to do the research, the teaching appropriately, which I love teaching, and it's a big duty towards the younger generation, and similarly for mentoring and advising, to simply find the time for all of this and do it all well, the way our mentees and advisees deserve. I think it's challenging, but also ultimately very very rewarding.
If you had a magic wand, let's say, would there be anything that you would want to change in academia, for instance? Is there anything that you don't like? Or, I mean, we talked about at the beginning, what you like about academia, that you're flexible, etc. And then, I mean, you talked about the benefits of it. But would there be something or anything, that you would want to change?
I think it's very related to what we spoke about earlier, which is the lack of opportunity, and the very, very unequal opportunities people face. If I had a magic wand, it's absolutely what I would change. Leveling the playing field so that people from different backgrounds, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, could make it into academia, economics specifically. But I think that's a problem in academia overall. Things might be getting better. I don't have concrete data to say that, but um, things are still so unequal. Whether it's which country you're coming from, or which income group you're from. I think gender, race. There's just so many inequalities still that we have to work on.
Yeah, that also reminded me. I'll try to describe it. You know the Rawlsian way of describing a table, like discussion table. Like, so let me just explain it for the audience. So basically, rich and poor people, everyone comes together like around a table, and the next day you will wake up and then you don't know whether you will be rich or poor. It's randomly distributed, so you can be super rich or you can be someone sleeping on a street. So what they want to decide, for instance, in terms of the wealth distribution or income distribution, is like whether they want this inequality, or they want a better actually outcome where they're not going to be like super rich or they're not going to be like super poor. So that's something, since we talked about these inequalities, that table discussion or that anecdote actually, I mean, I think it's very important to think about these things. And tomorrow, I mean, of course it's not going to be randomly distributed, but policies and all these kinds of things, that they can be determined based on that logic. I think I really love that kind of description of the world. It's too utopian maybe, but I think I find it very
The veil of ignorance. It's a good metaphor because it tries to make you think about, if you didn't know your position in the world, what kind of society would you like? So
that's
I
right,
mean,
yeah.
it tries to encapsulate, I think, a lot of our sense of what justice is, liberal justice is. Not every, yeah, anyway. Hard to do that though. That's exactly, the problem. Yeah. Because none of us are actually behind the veil of ignorance. That's what makes it so hard.
That's right, exactly. So maybe one last question. So if you could not be an economist in a parallel universe, what would you like to be?
I would do research in biology.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. Why biology? Like,
I think it's fascinating how the human body works, and actually how little, that's a bit scary, how little we still know about many things. So I think that would be fascinating to do research on biology and diseases and ways to cure them. And yes, that's the other counterfactual life I could have imagined.
Yeah, I'm sure you would be also very successful in biology as well. So thank you very much, Stefanie. I think it was a lovely talk. It was a great conversation, and it was nice to have you here with us. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us through at lacpodcast@gmail.com, or you can tweet at poid_cast. And see you in the next episode. Thank you, everyone.